Today, we're going to talk about the problems with democracy and how, in a multicultural society, it leads to something that I'm going to call the democratic breeding and migration game. A common implementation of democracy means one person, one vote. So, in a multicultural and civic nationalist society, the total number of citizens from each community represents their total voting power. Increases in a community's population due to further migration or due to breeding could result in a growing amount of the voting power in that society. The problems that can emerge occur when a community's population is proportionally growing larger at a faster rate than the ancestral and native population. The community with the fastest growing population will eventually have enough voting power to hold a majority. These communities win the democratic breeding and migration game. Communities with the most citizens hold the most voting power. If external communities can migrate into a society at a sufficient rate or outbreed the other communities within a society, they can eventually achieve majority control of that society due to voting power. That is the democratic breeding and migration game. Regardless of whether any communities in a multicultural society are intentionally playing this game to win or not, the outcomes are still the same. Power is transferred to those that breed the most, and to those that can outnumber the existing ancestral and native populations using migration. One huge problem with this outcome is that a transfer of power from one community to another doesn't mean there is any correlation with creating a more prosperous society. In fact, these changes of demographics could be seriously degrading and even destructive for a society over the long term. The objective function for gaining power is to simply increase your numbers. These other communities do not need to have the capability or objective to create a prosperous, fair, and highly functional society. Those aren't requirements for winning this game. A number of political parties could be advocates for increasing migration, and one of these parties could be elected. Increasing the size of migrant communities can result in giving them even more voting power once they are given citizenship. If you're using a liberal democratic system where every community has one vote per person, then migrant communities with citizenship will only need a certain percentage of the voting power from the rest of the population to achieve a majority. The more that migrants are invited into a society and given citizenship with voting rights, the easier it becomes to achieve a majority without the involvement of the ancestral and native population in a democratic vote. Over time, the migrant community could require less and less votes from the ancestral and native population, assuming the migrant communities are proportionally growing their numbers faster than the ancestral and native population. Breeding is one reason why democratic voting power will change over time. Each community and culture is different, and some communities might reproduce more than others. If a country invites a population into their society that then consistently reproduces more than the ancestral and native population, it is likely that the new migrant community will eventually become the majority. It's also fairly natural to expect that a migrant community would be more accepting of other people coming into this society whom they share a lot of commonalities with, such as other family members, friends, and people that share the same ancestral background. These people could be coming from the original societies that the migrants came from. The problem with the likelihood of this preference is that once these migrant communities become a majority, it becomes unlikely that the voting power will ever return back to the historical population. This is especially true in situations where the external societies are already a lot larger in population, as in those cases you only need a small percentage of further migration to solidify the change in demographics. Demographics don't change incredibly quickly, so it becomes highly unlikely for the ancestral and native population to ever have a majority again. The new voting power majority can even solidify their new position by importing more migrants into the country to help ensure that they never become a minority in the future. The differences in community breeding and the amount of migration will determine who will have a voting power majority in the future. This could cause a lot of problems and conflict. The first problem we should mention is around legitimacy. If it was a representative government that enabled this change of migration and the acceptance of these communities, it doesn't mean there was actually a democratic mandate to demographically change and eventually replace the existing population. As I've mentioned previously, different populations have different genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture. It's a huge decision to change the demographics of a population. So, if there was never a democratic vote to accept and embrace this change in the first place, the outcomes could be considered democratically illegitimate. There might have already been clear signs from the historical population that this was never wanted or accepted as a change to the society. Why would the ancestral and native population want to become a minority in their own homeland? They risk replacement and unequal treatment from the new majority. They would rely on the goodwill of the new majority for the foreseeable future. This kind of outcome may have never happened if a democratic vote was carried out with the historical population. The second problem to consider is around demographic replacement. Let's summarize some different ways that could happen. For breeding, demographic replacement can happen due to different trends in when people reproduce and how many kids these different communities have on average. Another factor is cultural differences. If one culture prefers to own a house before having kids, changes in demographics could put a strain on this cultural preference if increased demographics decrease the affordability of housing. This could further exacerbate this birth rate problem due to these differences between communities. If the ancestral and native population are experiencing a degrading quality of life due to economic problems, this could be another factor that influences the rate in which they have children. In comparison, a migrant community could be experiencing a higher quality of life, so this different lived experience around quality of life could have the opposite effect, where they are more willing to have children. Another factor that could influence demographic replacement is policy changes. Certain policies could benefit some communities over others. Some communities have larger families compared to others, for instance. Policy changes could even reinforce and speed up demographic change if they benefit certain communities over others due to the differences that exist between these communities. Disputes and conflict around changing culture, laws, values, and identity more broadly could lead to the exodus of some communities that don't feel welcome or safe anymore in that society. These changes in society could even result in the ancestral and native population fully abandoning their own homeland. A third problem that needs to be highlighted is how these changes in demographics can vastly change a society. They can be harmful for things like social cohesion or the overall prosperity of the nation. One of the genetic concerns to consider is how any population change is influencing the average intelligence of that society. IQ and general intelligence is not the same across all populations. So if general intelligence is reduced over time, it could have a number of bad knock-on effects, such as crime, violence, or a lack of economic prosperity due to less skills and capability. A growing number of problems in a society could result in the ancestral and native populations moving to other countries for better opportunities. This is highly concerning, as intelligent people that have more skills and options than others are likely the ones who can most easily migrate to other places. So a migration problem into the country that lowers economic prosperity could also lead to brain drain, where intelligent and highly skilled individuals leave the country. A decreasing level of average intelligence could therefore be catastrophic for a society and its long-term prosperity, especially if it also led to an exodus of intelligent people that previously lived in that society. Demographic changes could lead to dramatic changes in the prevalence of different cultures and ancestral backgrounds in a society. Certain ethnic backgrounds could be increasingly replaced or even removed over the long term due to differences in the expansion and contraction of each different community. Changing demographics could also mean that certain assets of heritage, such as infrastructure, artifacts, or monuments, become increasingly irrelevant to these new and growing communities. These assets might not be prioritized or be well maintained in the long term. This heritage could become forgotten and ignored. Large demographic changes can morph or even fully replace the original culture. Language, cuisine, or even social norms, everything could change or be replaced. Large population changes also don't necessarily lead to positive societal outcomes. The work ethic and the amount of contributions made towards society could be vastly different across communities. Crime rates and the type of crime could also be vastly different. The increasing size of one community could mean increasing certain types of crime. Focusing solely on human equality and one person, one vote means you can actually be ignoring the importance of sustaining certain identities and their ancestral, genetic, or cultural differences. Large-scale demographic changes that occur without concern to what those changes will cause can be extremely harmful for diversity over the long term. If there is no effort to sustain ancestral, genetic, or cultural differences, you actually risk losing all of these forms of diversity, and in some cases, irreversibly. The only way you can properly protect these things across different societies is by treating these distinct identities differently than other identities. In a given society, the question is, which identities is the society responsible for protecting? If the ancestral and native population is not able to protect itself, it does not have self-determination. It lives under the whim and goodwill of the majority, which could lead to ongoing suppression, population decay, and replacement. If migrants already have their own ancestral homelands elsewhere, and the current ancestral population only has that homeland, it makes more sense to protect the ancestral and native identity as it's their only home. Once that's gone, they have nowhere else to go. The replacement of populations and changing majorities mean you risk losing certain identities, which includes their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. If identity is not protected in any society, you shouldn't be surprised if some of those identities eventually vanish. So, just adopting a simple liberal and democratic approach in a multicultural society can be potentially catastrophic for protecting ancestry, genetics, culture, and heritage. Any ancestral population with its own distinct identity needs to be fully aware of the ramifications of using a simple one-person, one-vote system and enabling migration that can lead to demographic replacement. These ancestral populations need to look at the differences between their society and others. They need to understand what is happening in each community and also what the data and trends are showing. The ancestral and historical population needs to ask themselves, are you actually happy with the possibility of being fully replaced in your own homeland over the long term? Was that ever something that you wanted to happen? If it does happen, you will lose self-determination to decide how you want to live with your own people that share your ancestral background. A country's ancestral and native population needs to understand how society can drastically change when you invite migrants into their society with a liberal democratic system. Adopting this approach means these societies would have started to play the democratic breeding and migration game. And with that comes with all the risks around ongoing demographic replacement. A society that potentially becomes increasingly less cohesive and functional over the long term. You cannot simply invite any group of people into a society and expect the same results. A fourth problem with changing demographics and new majorities in democratic systems is how majorities treat minorities. Just because the ancestral and native population majority was fair and reasonable to the minority in the past does not mean the new voting power majority will be fair and reasonable to the shrinking majority that is now becoming the minority. You cannot say with certainty how those communities will be treated and how laws, regulations, and taxation could change. Changes that could benefit some communities over others. A community with a majority in voting power that is elected into government is able to vote on changes that are heavily in their own interests. An obvious one could be migration changes that solidify their majority to further increase their voting power. The interests of the emerging majorities do not need to be aligned with the preferences and interests of the ancestral and native population. The ancestral and native population would rely on the goodwill of the new and emerging majority. Historical regulations won't reliably protect them. The new majority can change many or all of the national laws and policies when they are in power. Hopefully, it's fairly easy to understand that enabling large demographic change is a very risky proposition that mostly relies on the goodwill of the new and emerging majorities. The final problem with the demographic replacement of the ancestral and native population is how the breeding and migration game forces the native and ancestral population to behave in a different way than they might have if they were more easily able to defend their own interests. A multicultural society with one person One vote can experience a tribalistic approach to voting. Communities can vote in unison to promote and protect their own interests. This may only further deepen the disputes and potential conflict. The ancestral and native population are now forced to play the same breeding game as the new migrant communities. The ancestral and native population might prefer and be more focused on innovation and prosperity rather than having large families. They might have been content with keeping the population a similar amount, or letting it reduce for a period of time. But, due to migration and other communities outbreeding them, everything the ancestral and native population achieve and work for could be inherited by this new migrant population. Worse than that, when these other communities become a voting power majority, they are able to tax the profits and wealth from the ancestral and native population if they wanted to for their own benefit. The democratic breeding and migration game forces everyone to play the same game. Otherwise, they will likely not sustain their current amount of voting power. Why should the ancestral and native population be forced to change how they live their life to respond to the voting power problem from not reproducing as much as other communities? They, of course, don't need to play this game. They don't need to give citizenship or voting rights to migrants. This is all a migration policy choice. It is a choice of the ancestral and native population whether they want to play this breeding and migration game or not. Genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture all play a part in establishing and governing a society. Societies are built over generations. A society that is considering migration and the impact of inviting different communities into an established society needs to thoroughly understand and monitor the changes that could and do happen. A society needs to do this if they want to be informed about how migration is changing society over time and whether that's been positive or negative. You need to understand the differences between populations, the data that emerges in these multicultural societies, and the future projected outcomes that might likely happen based on the ongoing trends. A society doesn't need to play the complex and risky democratic breeding and migration game. Societies may prefer to remain homogeneous and retain their own identity, or they might prefer to be multicultural. But even if they want to be multicultural, they don't need to give people citizenship and voting power in their governments. This choice is up to each society. There's nothing wrong with going down the path of a multicultural society, but the risks need to be properly understood. If a society wants to avoid the problems surrounding fast-changing demographics, which can quickly influence voting power, they need to be very careful about the people that they invite in and which migrants, if any, they are going to give citizenships and voting power. One alternative to consider is the adoption of a democratic ethnic state based on the population's ancestral and native identity. This would ultimately mean that migrants wouldn't influence elections and governance decisions. Alternatively, they could of course reverse migration and deport migrants and become more homogeneous again over time. A society needs to be able to reverse migration outcomes that haven't gone as planned. Otherwise, a society can be perpetually left in a state of stasis, disruption, and chaos. With this all in mind, we can now think about following the idea of liberalism to its logical conclusion. We'll do that in the next one. See you soon.